A hitman was nicknamed the Man from Toronto, but we'll just call him Toronto. Before he became a legendary murderer, he was actually a good man, but he changed after seeing his grandfather torn by a bear. Since then, he has turned into a cold and vicious person. When he grew up, he decided to become a hitman, and now he was threatening a man to provide important information. Even though he seemed brutal, Toronto had a good knowledge in the culinary. Even before he left the house, he gave tips and tricks on how to choose food ingredients. After Toronto left, the man was immediately executed. In another place, there was a man named Teddy Jackson. He's a fitness equipment salesman who likes to live stream every day to offer his wares. He did everything he could to sell his goods, but he often experiences bad luck in his life. The next day, Teddy woke up his wife, Lori, then wished her a happy birthday. Even though he was only a salesman, Teddy wanted to celebrate this special day by going on a honeymoon with his wife. Therefore, Teddy had booked a holiday cottage in Ononcock, Virginia. He also promised not to spoil the celebration of his wife's birthday like in previous years. In this conversation, Lori asked about the online shop that her husband was starting. Teddy assured Lori that his product idea would definitely be approved by the boss, and he also promised to pay debts and repair all damaged goods at their house. Unfortunately, expectations are not always in line with reality. Again, Teddy got bad luck because his idea was rejected outright by his boss. Not only that, his boss also said that Teddy only used up the company budget, especially since Teddy's promotions did not bring in new customers. Because of that, Teddy was finally fired. On the other hand, Toronto was cooking at his house. It turns out his cooking skills are on par with a chef. He also had an aesthetic kitchen which is used to store weapons and money. While he cooks, he gets a call from the handler who puts him in touch with the client. Toronto got a new mission in Virginia, and he agreed because the pay was quite high. After that, Toronto immediately went to that place. At the same time, Teddy and Lori were about to leave for Virginia for a vacation. When they got there, Teddy ordered spa services for his wife while he was going to meet the villa owner to pay the rent. Unfortunately, the address on the paper he brought was blurry. Because of that, he got the wrong address and entered the cottage with number 1465. But it turned out that the house was the meeting place between Toronto and his client. Toronto's client misunderstood and thought that Teddy was the Man from Toronto. When he entered the basement, Teddy was shocked to see a man who was being held hostage. Here, Teddy finally realized that the cottage was not the place he rented for the holidays. But Toronto's client already thought that Teddy was a hitman. Because he couldn't escape, Teddy was forced to obey his client's wishes. Apparently, Toronto's job was to interrogate the man who was hanged until he wanted to give the information. At this moment, Teddy actually felt panicked because he didn't know anything, but with his sales skills, he was able to interrogate the target even though he looked very ridiculous. Surprisingly, Teddy's method actually succeeded in making the target reveal the information, and then he told the secret code. But suddenly, the cabin was raided by the FBI. Not wanting to be blamed, Teddy tried to convince the FBI that he's not the mysterious assassin, the Man from Toronto. But unfortunately, Teddy's face has spread among the FBI agents and the mafia, so it was difficult for him to escape this case. In fact, his face had been recognized by a former soldier called Colonel Marin, who was now the target of the FBI because he carried out a coup in his country and is now starting to disturb America. Because of that, Teddy was asked to pretend to be the Man from Toronto, so that Marin could be arrested. Even though Teddy refused, the FBI still continued to persuade him. Not only that, they even offered protection for Lori, prepared her birthday celebration, and paid off his debt. After thinking about it again, Teddy finally accepted the tempting offer. So the next day he had to meet Colonel Marin in Washington, D.C. The FBI agents then told him to delve into his role as the Man from Toronto, so as not to be suspected by their target. While the real Man from Toronto was tracking Teddy's whereabouts, he easily got Teddy's email address from the documents left in the cottage. He hacked the email to find out Teddy's identity, and also his strengths and his weaknesses. But when Toronto opened Teddy's drive, he only found a video of Teddy while he was live streaming to sell his goods. However, Toronto stays alert of Teddy, because who knows if he had a hidden power. Somewhere else, Teddy was calling Lori, and he was forced to lie to his wife, saying that he was helping his boss prepare a presentation. Hearing this, Lori didn't mind. After all, she was currently enjoying luxury spa facilities and was accompanied by a handsome man named Santoro. Lori didn't know that the man was an FBI agent. Teddy, who was a little jealous, asked his wife to be careful with Santoro. After that, he also warned Santoro not to steal his wife. The next morning in Washington, D.C., Teddy began carrying out his mission. First of all, he had to memorize lines from a 19th century poem because it was a secret code belonging to the real Toronto. However, Toronto was also there and observing Teddy from a distance. After memorizing the poem, Teddy rushed to meet Colonel Marin's wife, Daniela. But after they met, Teddy forgot about the poem and just babbled on. Even so, Daniela still believed him and immediately asked him to go somewhere. On the way, Daniela explained to Teddy that he had to find someone called Mr. Green, that person holding something that Colonel Marin needed. Then Daniela told Teddy that their next destination was Puerto Rico. On the other hand, Toronto managed to take an FBI agent hostage and forced him to follow Teddy. In the end, Toronto infiltrated the plane and intended to reveal Teddy's cover. Teddy was trying to convince Daniela's men that he was the real man from Toronto. In the middle of the debate, Teddy continued to babble, making Toronto annoyed. Fed up, the man from Toronto immediately did his brutal actions. That time, the situation on the plane became even more chaotic after Toronto killed the pilot. Here, he wanted to show if he was the real man from Toronto. However, the unstable plane made everyone their sway. After the plane was under control, Toronto interrogated Teddy, then asked how Teddy got into the cottage in Virginia. He also tried to find out information about where this plane was going and who the next target would be. Instead of answering, Teddy whined because he didn't want to get involved any further. What's more, he had promised to have dinner with his wife. Toronto didn't believe Teddy and threw Teddy's cell phone and the tracking device given by the FBI away. Now Teddy was trapped with the most dangerous assassin in the world, and like it or not, he had to obey Toronto's orders. Long story short, Teddy and Toronto arrived in Puerto Rico, but again, Teddy grumbled because he couldn't bear to see the bodyguards on the plane who were killed. At the same time, Toronto blew up the plane to remove his traces. Toronto then casually reported to the handler that he had succeeded in catching Teddy, while Teddy could only surrender. He then asked what his role was in this mission, and Toronto said that he was just asking Teddy for two things. First, Teddy had to be quiet, and second, Teddy had to remember the first rule, be quiet. Not long after that, the plane explosion was getting bigger. Toronto decided to continue Teddy's disguise, so he asked Teddy to pretend to be the man from Toronto. To make this mission succeed, Toronto dressed up Teddy to make him look more convincing. Apart from that, he also taught Teddy the types of knives. Teddy was only used as a shield, so he could only surrender. But in return, Teddy asked to be bought spicy chips so he wouldn't be in a bad mood. After that, they prepared to meet the clients at an event held by a technology company. When he got there, Teddy went into the room to meet the client. Here, the client asked him to interrogate several people in the room and find out which of them is the real Mr. Green. That person must be found immediately and then brought before Colonel Marin. While Teddy entered the room, Toronto monitored from another room and gave directions using earpieces. Because he didn't know what to do, Teddy ended up doing silly things, like playing with a knife in front of the targets because he thought it was a cool thing. But actually, he looked very stupid and was considered a clown by everyone in the room. Even though he was laughed at, Teddy continued to babble in front of the targets while scaring them by playing with a knife. But the knife accidentally scratched the face of one of the targets, and it turned out that Teddy had a phobia of seeing blood, so he immediately vomited. Strangely enough, the vomit actually brought Teddy blessings because of that, the targets were scared and they thought that it was a characteristic of Toronto. Once again, Teddy managed to reveal the secrets in a strange way. But for some reason, the client actually pointed a gun at Mr. Green, even though the man was supposed to be taken to Colonel Marin. Seeing that, Teddy tried to buy time until the real Toronto entered the room. Before the client shot Mr. Green, Toronto entered the room, and at the same time, the handler betrayed Toronto by sending an assassin, the man from Miami. He was ordered by the handler to seize this big mission and finish off Toronto. Meanwhile, Toronto interrogated Mr. Green about the secret project he was working on. Here, Mr. Green said that the project was to make a seismic bomb ordered by Colonel Marin. Therefore, Colonel Marin wanted to catch him, especially since the access code to detonate the bomb was in his fingerprints. For your information, a seismic bomb is dropped from a height, and when it hits the ground, it will explode. The explosion could cut through beneath the soil layer to create a large cave or crater. Therefore, this bomb is often called an earthquake bomb. Well, here, Colonel Marin would use this bomb to blow up the Venezuela embassy in Washington, D.C. Hearing that, the man from Toronto immediately cut off Mr. Green's thumb. Of course, Teddy was annoyed because he didn't like violence, but on the other hand, Toronto had no conscience at all. Besides, everyone already thinks of Teddy as Toronto. So if something happens, the one who will be in trouble is Teddy. When the two of them were arguing, the man from Miami suddenly came and a shootout couldn't be avoided. Because of the fight, Teddy got stuck in an amusement ride. Afraid of heights, Teddy continued to scream hysterically, while Toronto kept asking him to throw the packet of chips with Mr. Green's thumb inside it. But unfortunately, Mr. Green's thumb fell. After beating man from Miami, Toronto treated the wound on Teddy's buttocks because he was shot. After treating Teddy, Toronto reported to the handler that someone was bothering him. On the other hand, even though he was physically bad, Teddy had very strong instincts. He thought that the handler had betrayed Toronto and wanted to finish off him, especially since the handler sounded like he already knew what Toronto was going through. But Toronto still didn't believe it because he has worked with the handler for 20 years. In the end, Teddy still continued his mission and rushed on a plane to Washington, D.C. On the way, Teddy talked about his unlucky life, because so far he only experienced luck once. That was when he married Lori. But after being married for so many years, his relationship with Lori was not very good, especially since he was often scolded by his wife. After getting off the plane, Teddy borrowed Toronto's cell phone to call his wife. He wanted to keep the promise of dinner that he had planned long ago. Here, Teddy invited Toronto to come along to dinner, because Lori also invited Anne. Shortly it was dinner time already. At the same time, there was news about the inauguration of the Venezuelan embassy in America, and the office would be the bombing target carried out by Colonel Marin. On the other hand, the FBI was continuing to monitor Teddy's movements in the restaurant. They wanted to make sure that Teddy didn't do anything strange, even though from the start he never acted normally. At the same time, Toronto seemed worried because there were lots of CCTV cameras. Teddy then asked Toronto, his new friend, to relax a little. Teddy even taught Toronto how to smile in a friendly way. Toronto was actually a little awkward around women, but Teddy didn't believe it because the FBI said that Toronto once had a close friend named Deborah, even though Teddy didn't know that Deborah was the name of Toronto's car. During the dinner, Anne tried to tease Toronto because she thought that he is the only handsome bald person. Anne also praised Toronto's car and nice tattoos, making him feel comfortable. Even Toronto became more open. He told her about his dream of wanting to open a restaurant. After dinner, the two couples went down to the dance floor, and surprisingly, Toronto fell in love with Anne. But suddenly, Teddy saw the man from Miami, so he invited Toronto to run away. After finding a safe place, Toronto thought that Anne really liked him, even though this was a very tense situation. Seeing Toronto who was in love, Teddy felt both funny and annoyed. But unfortunately, the man from Miami managed to find them both. The man from Miami asked for a piece of Mr. Green's finger, and Teddy handed over it because he was afraid. Before leaving, the man from Miami mentioned the incident in Minnesota, which made the man from Toronto's reputation bad because he failed to carry out his mission. Feeling offended, Toronto immediately attacked the man from Miami. Unfortunately, Toronto was too emotional and was finally defeated. Shortly, the man from Miami met Colonel Marin at a luxury hotel. He handed over a packet of chips containing Mr. Green's thumb. The handler was also present to negotiate the price of the man from Miami's services, and Colonel Marin agreed to pay the wanted amount. Meanwhile, Teddy and Toronto tried to catch the man from Miami by stealing a police car. While driving, Toronto told the details of the incident in Minnesota that had tarnished his reputation. At that time, he failed to kill his target because the target's child witnessed the incident. So he didn't want the target's child to grow up to be a cold-blooded killer like him. Since that incident, he intended to retire and build a restaurant. He begged Teddy to pretend to be him one last time, and he also promised that this mission will not result in casualties. At the same time, Colonel Marin was preparing to bomb the embassy of Venezuela, but fortunately Teddy appeared at the right time. According to the plan, Teddy pretended to be the man from Toronto, even though the handler was there and he already knew his identity. Teddy succeeded in making him very annoyed, while Colonel Marin felt he was being tricked. But Teddy kept trying to convince Colonel Marin that he was the real man from Toronto. Then not long after, a grenade rolled on the floor. The handler and the man from Miami managed to escape, and Toronto also took away the handler's money. Meanwhile, Teddy was taken home by the FBI to meet Lori. Unfortunately, Lori had already left the restaurant. She seemed angry because she felt her husband lied to her. At that time, Teddy felt very sorry. To cheer him up, the FBI was grateful and thanked Teddy for saving many people. After everything was over, Teddy's life was back to normal. only he felt very sad because Lori didn't want to meet him, and it seemed like she was still upset about the incident in Washington, D.C. On the other hand, Toronto got threats from the handler who would kill Teddy if Toronto didn't return the money. Because Toronto ignored her threat, the handler planned to finish off Toronto and Teddy. She immediately mobilized all her best assassins from Moscow, Tokyo, and Tacoma. At the same time, Teddy was pensive while doing live streaming, and not long after, Lori told him that she would be taking the train to her mother's house. Teddy immediately ran to the station to persuade her to return home, but suddenly a car hit him. Turns out, the person who hit him was the man from Miami. Then he forced Teddy to tell him where the man from Toronto was. Unexpectedly, the man from Toronto was already there and immediately showed his brutal actions. Teddy rushed to the station, but unfortunately, he got another attack. Finally, Teddy went into the gym where he used to work to hide from the assassins. Because he didn't know how to shoot, Teddy could only point his gun, and everyone at the gym was scared. Teddy asked for the key to the back door to escape, but unfortunately the assassins had surrounded the place. At this point, Teddy and Toronto were cornered, especially as the man from Miami also pointed a gun at Toronto. He was angry because Toronto had taken away his money. In this urgent situation, Teddy's courage suddenly appeared because he was fed up. He gathered all his strength to beat the man from Miami. Not long after that, the handler came to the place full of anger. Teddy and Toronto ran away into a food factory, and they told all the employees to run. Meanwhile, the handler continued to follow them into the factory. Because they had no choice, Toronto decided to give her the car key because the money was there. But this brutal woman still wanted to kill him. Finally, Toronto prepared another plan and told Teddy to press the engine lever, and a huge explosion occurred. After everything was over, Teddy admitted that he was happy to be friends with Toronto because he could have an experience he never have had before, and he would never forget it. Toronto had inspired Teddy and made him want to become stronger. Teddy was shocked because Toronto suddenly disappeared because there was still a man from Tokyo. But when the Japanese assassin was about to attack Teddy, Toronto suddenly appeared and bumped into him. Seeing this made Teddy frustrated because this chain of murders seemed to have no end. Toronto, who felt sorry for Teddy, immediately told him to follow Lori by driving his car, Deborah, but Teddy had to hurry because the police were chasing him from behind. Luckily, Teddy wasn't too late. He realized that he really needed Lori and couldn't live without her. Seeing her husband battered, Lori looked very worried, and in the end, she forgave Teddy because he was a faithful husband. After that, a shocking incident occurred where Deborah was hit by a train and made Toronto's money scatter. 1 year later, the man from Toronto was finally able to open his restaurant business. Teddy, Lori, and Anne visited the restaurant to congratulate Toronto on the opening of the restaurant. Now Toronto has changed into a friendlier person and is no longer brutal like before. Only he still has a grudge against Teddy for making his Deborah damaged. In the end, Teddy opened an online fitness business which really doesn't make sense, but he was very confident that this business could be successful.